folks, welcome to what I think is our last patron interview for 2022 because we're rapidly getting into the holiday season. With us today is Danny Bate. So Danny, will you tell us a little bit about your life, work, and what, I'm always interested in talking to other people who do this kind of thing. Like, what brought you to bringing your field of study to the public on the internet?
Sure. Yeah, it's a big question. I haven't had it phrased in that way before, and I like it as a question. So, by way of myself, I'm a PhD student. I specialize in historical linguistics, and I'm currently at the University of Edinburgh. Edinburgh is also where I currently physically am as well. So yeah, I've been focusing in. I think I've eventually kind of honed in on my vocation, my academic vocation, if I have one, historical linguistics, very gradually. It really started when I was doing my undergraduate degree, where for some reason, I think it was just the university was in a very, very historic city. They offered medieval Latin. I took that. I didn't quite know what to expect, and I just fell in love with the idea of studying ancient languages, or in this case, medieval languages. Slowly, I realized that doing linguistics as my main degree with medieval Latin on the side, I didn't have to keep these things separate. I could combine them. There was an intersection of these two fields, and I could apply the theories of linguistics to the medieval Latin and then to other languages, other ancient languages as time went by. So I think it was a very, very gradual but very natural coming together of two things that I love. For some reason, I have to think back, or perhaps scroll back would be the better word, but during my master's degree, I really got into Twitter. There's no real reason for why this particular website beyond all others. Other platforms are available, like YouTube, for example, but Twitter works very well for me, and I get a huge sense of accomplishment and of real joy, of pleasure, and of being able to share the stuff that I love with other people. I think there's a very, very good and very receptive audience out there. Not to make it too much about myself, but there is also like a consequential benefit of this for me, which is I'm a great believer in the principle that you only understand something if you can explain it or teach it to someone else.
Yeah.
And so Twitter, this idea, this kind of very ready platform, this format for introducing people and talking about these things has been so helpful. I maintain despite the obvious flaws and the problems with that sometimes infuriating platform, there is something about Twitter which has made me twice, thrice the linguist that I ever could be without it. So yeah, that's me in a sense.
Can I cut in here and ask, do you mean, for example, that trying to explain things in the character limit of Twitter is helpful to you?
Exactly. So yeah, character
Yeah.
limit. It's so how can I put it? It's so demanding and so exacting. It can really refine your language and your skill in writing. If you're trying to kind of crush these pretty big ideas into 280 characters, then wow, you have to get to know your own skill in writing pretty well. So
I really appreciate what you're saying there.
yeah,
I absolutely agree with the maxim that you have to be able to explain something. Well, if you can explain something and you truly understand it, like you said, I
yeah,
think that maxim is absolutely true. And I think, I probably don't always come across this way, but I appreciate economy in words. And
sure.
Twitter was a huge outlet for me in the year 2014-15 when I was between academic jobs, uh, working a job that often challenged my dignity, I guess I would
Right.
say. Um,
Sure.
and I had this document on my phone where, I had the character count in it, and I would just like compose tweets like haikus, right? Like just try to make
Yeah.
that like exactly 140 characters or whatever. Yeah, yeah. So I understand a little bit of what you're saying with that. So
Sure.
Twitter being not just a way, for me, Twitter is almost nothing to do with work. Like I use it maybe to promote something I've done somewhere else, right? Like go
Hmm.
look at this YouTube video, go look at this book. But to you, Twitter is more of a primary
Hmm.
than a secondary.
Yes, it has remained the primary. I think it's there's an idea in Twitter in comparison to say YouTube, for example, that there are maybe more YouTube specific skills that you might need to get your message across and to create some content that people want to say. Whereas Twitter, yes, definitely it does depend on your some pre-existing skills and what you bring to it. But there's not much in the way of um, things like editing skills, for example, things that you need at YouTube, creating a thumbnail, for example,
Mm.
it's not nothing. You know, you do need some idea of how to do this and how to appeal to people. So much the same way that you could learn how to, make YouTube work to your advantage. I do believe that yes, with time you can make Twitter work to your advantage, but there are some skills really that I don't have. As much as I'd like to get involved in YouTube, I think it's a fantastic outlet for accessible videos and for content that can make a difference. I'm just aware that there are some hurdles that I'd need to jump first if I were to crack on with that.
I think you're probably seeing them as bigger hurdles than they are. I mean, I manage with, you know, thumbnails that would make a 5-year-old blush and,
I don't
audio
know.
quality that's, bathroom level. I
Mhm.
think just doing it, is a lot of the battle. I don't think
Mhm.
it takes too much specific skill.
Yeah, no,
So
fair
so
enough.
let me
And it
encourage you to branch out if you feel like it.
I appreciate that. Yeah, definitely. But yeah, for the moment, for as long as Twitter is around, I know it's been going through a bit of a rough patch recently. Although for as long as it's around, I will continue to frequent the Bird app.
I appreciate that. So and what you mostly deal with in your material that you put out for the public is
Mhm.
etymology.
Mm,
So tell us a little bit about what we talked about, making kind of a theme for today, which
mm.
is the how of etymology,
Yeah.
right? Someone says to you, I suppose, where does this word come from? What is your process?
Absolutely. It's an interesting one because I think etymologists and anyone who wants to get involved in etymology, very often you can learn this stuff by osmosis. You might not often take a step back and think about how you know these things. How are we able to say these things about the origins of words, which is etymology, by the way. That's really what it is, tracing the lineage and the origins of words and parts of a language. I often talk about, I think, like an etymologist's intuition. I think it is possible to have the intuition, to have a good sense when confronted with a word, where it comes from. And that intuition is built on a bedrock of facts and data and theories that maybe you don't think about very often. Maybe how do how do we know that? How am I able to say that a word comes from somewhere else? Because words don't have some sort of essential DNA. No, we can't lift the bonnet of a word and see, oh, okay, that's fine. Yep, that's a bit of Old Norse there, it's a bit of Old English. Yep, that's fine.
Hmm.
Words don't work like that. When we talk about the origins and the derivation of a word, it's much more. It's a theory. It's something that we have to extrapolate from the data. And so really, it's something that. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. Someone's just come in. It's really something that we have to work with the data and propose good histories and good theories, which may be weaker or stronger. It's perfectly possible for a word to have no confident, no likely etymology that we can pinpoint and say, that's it. It's frustrating, but very often that's just the way it works. Sometimes the written record, which is our primary source of evidence, just doesn't allow us to say we know with this word comes from X. So there's a lot of theory. There's a lot that goes into these big statements about the origins of words.
And I think I know what you mean about an etymologist's intuition. I think you or I with a background in this field, if we're presented with a word like, I don't know, where, and we know that the Old English word is where, or various variations on that in different dialects, but then say that also, just to make up an example, someone comes up and says that in Basque, and this is a made up example, this isn't real, but someone says, oh, well, there's a word that means something very similar that sounds very similar. Why is that not a legitimate explanation? And of course, if you don't have a background in this, you don't necessarily have an intuitive sense of like, well, that's way less likely that such a basic word would come from so far away, both geographically and linguistically, genetically in the sense of language. And I think that actually, in a sense, it's slightly counterintuitive because, I remember 20 years ago, my grandfather and I got really into the Zuni, and he found a book that argued that the Zuni in Western New Mexico are displaced Japanese people. And it included this page of words that were supposedly from Japanese and Zuni. And, I looked at it and within a second I said, this is horseshit. Pardon my French. Right. I mean, it's stuff like the word for chicken starts with a K in both of them. Right. But it's not, it's not necessarily intuitive. Like he also, he wasn't taken in by it, but I could see how someone could be. It's like, oh, wow. Right. The word for chicken really does look the same, but there's a broader, there's a critical mass at which you say, no, like there's a lot more here that cannot be explained, but that's not necessarily intuitive to someone who's not.
No, I agree, and I think that it does depend on that load of probability that you might have at the back of your brain, which can come from all sorts of places. I mean, yes, you might know the specific sound changes that happened in a particular language, but often your intuition, I say, you generally, the etymologist's intuition, just comes from history. Actually, a kind of a knowledge of history of, is this probable or not? Can we tie this story to the documented movement and interactions of people over time? So yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good example of how this is unlikely, and we want more. The burden of proof is too strong for us to make that sort of connection. That being said, it's also perfectly possible where we have counterintuitive etymologies.
Oh, yeah.
Ones where you think, where the etymologists, we have to go either like, no, I'm sorry, but those two very similar words are not related despite everything else. Or we have to say, actually, there is a connection here to be had. Allow me to elaborate on. So every single theory that we can come up with does need to stand on its own terms, and it does need to, as I say, needs to have this kind of weight behind it, which can come from all sorts of directions. It really can be quite surprising. A classic example, modern German today has the verb haben, extremely common word. Classical Latin has habere, which means to have. Both words mean to have. They look very similar. Syllable structure is similar. Sound structure, of course, the meaning is very similar. And yet along come etymologists around to kind of, ruin your day and say, no, these two words are not related. It's a fantastic example of this counterintuitiveness that very often that's where the theories lead us to. And I would only just beg people's patience and say, look, we've done our homework and there is a good reason for why we say these words are not related.
Right. And that is a fantastic example. And also the fact that for 1,000 years, people have perceived them as related words, because we even have the perfect structure and the verb calqued between one and the other.
There you go. So that could be an influence as well. That generally could be some sort of common origin for those two. But yeah, no, it is it is surprising, and yeah, I just have to ask for people's understanding.
So do you encounter etymology skeptics regularly? People who say, "Come on, this is kind of made up." Like you've got an obvious explanation for this here. Why do you ignore the obvious explanation and insist on these weird things about sound laws?
Yeah, that's a good one. I certainly come across people who are skeptical of certain things. I've never met someone yet. Twitter is a big place, so you never know. Someone who is outright skeptical of all etymology and as a field, or the idea that in general words have an origin from somewhere else. That's not quite happened yet, but definitely yes. People can be very skeptical. Sometimes I think it is a very fair skepticism. I think it's people who are expecting more. If I didn't know myself, and I was confronted with, for example, this English guy who's saying that two obviously related words are not related, then yeah, I would want more. I'd want some more proof. So that's fine. You do also meet people who maybe have a bit more of an agenda. People who are much more keen to push some idea, perhaps because it goes back to some narrative of history, that it connects two languages together. Very often it can be tied to social and political ideas and social and political understanding of oneself. That does happen. And I don't want to go into sort of concrete examples, but that in itself needs to be respected. I don't believe that etymology as a science can adopt this lofty neutral position. I don't think that exists. We can at least be rigorous. I think that's fair to say. We can at least say, look, we've worked this out. And if you want to offer a competing idea, then you've got to match us on our own terms. You've got to match that rigor. I think that's a reasonable requirement. I don't think it's fair to say that we can just remove science and have this lofty transcendental, oh yes, all language, I understand all of it. It doesn't really work like that. But I think we can insist on people going toe to toe, other ideas, other ideas matching the ideas that we adopt in terms of their thoroughness. That's how I'd put it.
Yeah, I mean, I do encounter some of the skepticism myself, and often it's of a fairly gentle type. It's just like, more of a kind of a who cares, kind of like, what does this get us? And I think that's a fair enough question. I mean, to me, I think it all adds up to a broader and deeper understanding of the past, who was interacting with who, where, and when, which I think is interesting. And then I do encounter some of those specific agenda-driven models. I mean, just to name one that you might or might not know about, there's a kind of pan-Slavicist movement that sees Germanic as Slavic and has all these weird explanations for how Germanic words come from Slavic that don't really stand up to the kind of scrutiny that you're talking about. But I run into that now and then.
And it's a shame in those particular instances, because they might miss things, and they might dismiss things which are most likely true. There is contact between early Germanic or Proto-Germanic and also early Slavic languages. There are examples of words that could well be borrowed from one language into another. But when you adopt this sort of completely dismissive, everything is Slavic, everything is Germanic, you miss the kind of more fine-grained picture, which I think in itself can be really rather wonderful, really beautiful, where these interactions are complicated. People are complicated, and life is complicated and messy, and I see no reason why language should not be otherwise. And you miss these really kind of fine-grained things, like well, I'd like to take an example of contact between two. In Germanic languages, we have kind of a family of words, related words across Germanic that has something to do with like fortification or fortifications. So I'm thinking specifically of town in English, which is related to town in Dutch, town in German. These in themselves could be borrowed from a Celtic origin as a separate language family. These in turn could have been borrowed by Slavic into Slavic. So we end up with words in Czech like team, Polish, kiniec, stuff like that. And I just think, isn't that fascinating? I mean, we're basically doing archaeology without any digging. The fact that all these peoples are borrowing some word for fortification, there's an archaeological or a social implication from that, that something good about these fortifications, something interesting, some sort of exchange is going on across Northern Europe that would allow this word to be borrowed, which is fascinating. But if you were to just say, oh, all Germanic is Slavic, then you would miss those little connections that actually could be true. So stuff like that, yeah.
I think that is exactly what's interesting. And, you know, I think that a version of what happens here is that people see one word that clearly shares some origin with another word. And I've seen it with something as simple as interest, right? Which is from Latin, borrowed from Latin. It's like, well, you know, a word is as common and basic as interest is borrowed from Latin. So English is basically a Romance language. Like people are trying to like claim there's kind of a flag planting that's attempted, whether for an agenda or not. Sometimes it doesn't have an agenda. I don't think there's much of an agenda behind trying to say English is a Romance language. But I think it's kind of funny because it comes with sort of this idea that, well, I've noticed one word that's common with another language that I sort of am familiar with. Therefore, this is under the same umbrella. It's like, well, what's the king word that decides that? Because, you know, like if we look at father and Dutch father, it's like, that could be the king word. Like, well, but instead, if we're deciding what the relationship between languages are, we look at a massive bulk of evidence that etymology isn't necessarily the number one consideration in. Right? I mean, our Armenian borrows so many words from Iranian, but has a core of vocabulary and grammar that has its own separate developments, and that's what matters in identifying it as its own branch of Indo-European, for example. So I think that there's a somewhat unintuitive use of the evidence too, because it's not necessarily like we're hunting down and adding up the tables and saying, okay, 60% of this dictionary has words that are traceable to borrowing some Latin, therefore this is a language from Latin.
Yes.
So I think that's sometimes a little bit counterintuitive too.
It's true, but it is, you know, the import, the relevance of all of this stops at the borders of etymology. A perfect example of Armenian, where the Persian, as you say, Iranian influence has been so strong, it doesn't make Armenians any less Armenian.
That's another thing. Yeah.
It doesn't. So I understand that people might feel a bit threatened, especially if you are somebody who's talking about etymology and you're not from that part of the world. I think there is also a sensitivity and a caution that we need to adopt in these cases. While I would agree with you, I still have to be respectful towards Armenians who may not be aware of this. They may not be aware because most Armenians are happily going around their lives and are not looking at the etymological influence of Iranian on Armenian. They may not be aware of it. Right. So there is also a kind of a hesitancy that I like to adopt in those particular claims, because, as I said, it doesn't make them any less Armenian in this particular case. I have a friend, for example, who is Welsh and is extremely, she's a non-linguist and is extremely passionately in disagreement with me about the influence of Latin on Welsh. As an etymologist, I can say that the influence has been very, very strong. This is not too surprising given the Roman presence in Britain. And it's just interesting because at the same time, while I might disagree with her on certain points and say, no, this word probably does have a Latin origin. Let's have a look at the evidence. I also think that it just doesn't affect her Welshness.
Sure.
It doesn't
Yeah,
make
right, right.
it doesn't affect the story of the country, whether I'm right or wrong. So yeah, you do come up against a lot of interests, a lot of self-interest, and I don't think we should be too surprised by that. I would just advise caution and patience.
No, and the interest itself, I think, is, well, I mean, it's the same thing in a sense as the interest that ultimately drove you or me to get invested in this. I mean, the interest is there. So
Sure.
if someone can be, guided to seeing seeing that with the lens that we're looking at it with,
Mhm.
perhaps they uh, can be persuaded to see it. I don't know.
Mm.
I'm not great at dealing with people who have deep, passionate investments in some countervailing narrative. My general thing is just like, well, I don't have the power to persuade you, so whatever. Um,
Mm. I
but
think you do need to recognize if it's if you can't win this battle. Yeah.
yeah, but it's interesting, like you say, people can get their identities really wrapped around this, and I do think that again, that actually that in a sense it's just a mutated form of the same interest that you or I have.
Sure.
Um, except
It
that I
is.
can talk about the etymology of a word in English and not feel anything about my identity is involved. Right.
No, that's
But maybe,
true. And
but maybe that's a specific thing to English, right? I mean, like,
yeah,
because English is so, it has such a dominating presence on the world stage right now that maybe that's kind of an English speaking aloofness from this, because like, well, what is threatening English, right? Whereas I might feel really differently if I
mhm.
were a native speaker of a language that was a little bit more threatened. I could see that.
I can definitely see that in terms of yes, the respective positions of these different languages. Obviously, English has a lot more speakers than say Armenian, for example. But there is also a sense in which if someone were to adopt some sort of puristic attitude towards English, if someone were to say, this language is only X, it only has X sources, it only has this particular ingredient, I think in English the battle would be lost before it was even fought.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, it
Yeah.
is just English has taken so much from other languages, has taken, depends on maybe not the right metaphor, has taken or has been given so much from other languages that I don't even know how you begin. It's interesting, for example, when people, not to say that, English or Anglophone chauvinism doesn't exist, of course it does, but when people tend to talk about the language of Shakespeare, for example, it's interesting how they never tend to go much further back than Shakespeare.
Right.
It's almost like the previous periods are just kind of lost to us. There's no way we could argue for some sort of purism and cite Middle English or Old English as our argument for that, because the external influences are just so strong.
Yeah.
There's no way that we could build up some sort of, nationalistic argument on the basis of Old English, because Old English, well, modern speakers of English can't read it.
Yeah, it's
We
too
can't.
foreign. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you could do that, for example, with a language like Greek or Icelandic, where there is this purism, well, not purism, conservatism that allows you to have this sense of affinity with the earliest sources. That's just not going to work in English. And it's always interesting how these arguments, they stop at Shakespeare, because I
Mhm.
suppose post Shakespeare, sort of post 1600, the influences on English have been there, but are perhaps slightly minimal. And now comes the point where English is not receiving, it's giving to other
Mhm.
languages. English is the one that's spreading itself around the world. So yeah, I would just say that perhaps one factor is just that how on earth would you create some sort of linguistic purism around English? I mean, it's done. Like it's the language is what it is.
Right. Well, I mean, although to be clear, I've seen it attempted, although, it's a very
Mm.
fringe It's nothing you could possibly get into the mainstream. People also just aren't as conscious about it. People just don't care about it.
Sure.
It's yeah. I mean, and of course that varies depending on language community. I think Icelanders care about the stuff a little bit more as a language speaking community. But
Absolutely. Yeah.
it's gotten kind of meta. So we were going to talk about some hows.
Mhm.
Do you have a favorite example you could walk us through some word, or do you want me to come up with a word or something
Oh, I
you could show
don't.
us, like how you would go about if you didn't know
Sure.
deducing a language or a word's origin?
Wow. Yeah, that's a good question. And as I say, you sort of have to do some self-reflection, tap into that etymologist's intuition, which sometimes may go wrong. You know, you may not come up with the goods. There are many words where, I don't know, some aspect of the word may lead you in one particular direction, and turns out there's a superior theory, a much stronger theory that actually points to its real origin. But I suppose we could, as you know, I think your audience may appreciate, we could focus specifically on Old Norse, because Old Norse definitely has a strong influence on English, has had that strong influence. I'm not here to deny that. I think it's a very, very general fact, but at the same time, it's maybe a fact that we don't interrogate too much. You may think, you know, oh, that word comes from Old Norse, and there's an end to it. But there are very, very concrete and specific things, specific kinds of evidence that allow us to say that a word, I'm using the word, it may not be words, but that something comes from Old Norse, that it has an origin in that concrete, specific language. So if you were to make up an English sounding word off the top of your head, something that plausibly could be an English sounding word, then, you know, if it ends in something like ete, ete, then I can probably say, well, that's not going to be Old Norse. That's most likely going to be Latin, for example. That's, well, maybe not my own surname, but that would be a bit short. But a longer word that has that ending attached. The shape of a word would be one example. So even you could be even more specific if you were confronted with a word that ends in ate. If it's a verb, for example, that could be a Latin word that has a Latin origin and has been borrowed directly from the Latin language, rather than through the intermediary of, say, French or Spanish, because words that go through words that come into English through those directions will have a different appearance, a different form. Hence the reason why English has all these doublets, these words that have the same origin, very often a Latin origin, but have come into English through different routes. So that would be a good example of how you can just look at a word and go, yeah, it's probably going to be a Latin origin. So in the case of Old Norse, then, the sort of the holy grail, like number one, the thing that we really want to say in order to say that a word has an Old Norse origin, would be a little bit of Old Norse grammar that's somehow still attached to the word. That would be ideal. So, for example, a word that comes to mind, anger. Anger, English word, I'd say you've called it some, you know, a bit of core vocabulary today in English. Well, why does it have an R on the end? Most likely it's the nominative singular r in Old Norse that for some reason has been borrowed into English, as well as the meaningful part of the word, the original root.
Well, for the
Those words,
record,
those are pretty rare, those words, I have to say.
well, I'll interject that R is actually part of the root. Some
Okay.
Old Norse nouns do have R as part of the root, and what's interesting is that when those are borrowed into English, they're borrowed with the R, whereas I've never seen a word where the grammatical ending, the nominative singular R, has been borrowed. So,
Right.
which shows that speakers borrowing the word are conscious of what is the root and what is the grammatical ending, which is
Sure.
pretty interesting in and of itself.
That really is. That says to me of I didn't know that, but it makes sense that it's yeah, part of the root or the stem of the word. And that makes sense to me that as an indicator that there's a really good understanding between the two languages that's going on. So when we often say that one word has been borrowed from another, we might ignore the fact that a word that's coming from Old French, more likely Old Norse, has a full set of endings. It has a full grammar. And so if in this particular case, some Old English speaker is listening to an Old Norse speaker and they keep hearing the R or the R, then yeah, as you say, they're going to extrapolate and say, yeah, okay, this is not grammar. I don't need to get rid of this. I can borrow it wholesale into the language. So yeah, that makes sense to me. The possibility is there then that maybe there are no such words where the grammar is borrowed as well.
I can think
It's possible.
I can think of one example of a word borrowed from Old Norse, and I'm talking about in the Old or Middle English period, because of course, in modern English, people have a different attitude toward Old Norse borrowing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, your recent like mythological based borrowings.
Mm-hmm.
But the one example I can think of where there's a grammatical ending is busk, which is from buask, so it has the mediopassive ending.
Right.
But still, that could be perceived as sort of part of the root meaning because it makes it mediopassive. Right? It's get yourself ready rather than just get something else ready. But that's the only place I can think of. For the most part, they seem to know, which to me it says that the people borrowing Old Norse words into Old English are confident speakers of Old Norse, right?
Yeah.
They're probably bilingual. So I'm trying to think of this anywhere else.
I think of busk as well. Is that what you said, or are you thinking another words?
I was thinking
of
busk,
yeah,
like busking on the street, although that's not.
I didn't know that one. Brilliant. I was thinking
Oh,
of bask.
bask too. Yeah, you're right. You're right. Because it's
Yes,
bathe
as in like
oneself.
to bathe oneself. Yeah, which is
Yeah.
awesome. I love that. But
So
then
it's
again,
interesting.
yeah, that really is borderline. Is that grammar or is that the meaning? What part of the word is that? So these really are, yeah, these are kind of iffy, these ones. It still feels like, I mean, you couldn't chop it off and have the same meaning. You couldn't get rid of the sk and be left with the same word. I mean, if you got rid of that, then Old English or Middle English would have had no reason to borrow it because they already had a word for bathe, to bathe. But no, and I agree. These are kind of borderline, these words.
Yeah, they are, and the very borderlineness is interesting in itself.
Yeah.
Huh.
No, that's fair enough. I think that then, like I said, these words, if they do exist in English, are fairly rare, and that's reasonable. They had to adapt these words into the grammar, into their own grammar. We are, though, on much safer territory with sounds, where the sound, which can be anywhere within the word, can be within the root. The sound is something that really we can only get from Old Norse, where there's some combination of consonants, specific vowels, specific consonants, where we just wouldn't expect that. We don't see it in Old English, and we certainly wouldn't expect it a word to have these particular sounds in Middle English. So I'm thinking of how from Middle English onwards, there's an increase in words that start with sk. So this is a fairly famous one. Things like skirt, where the Old English word is shirt. And the sh at the beginning of that is much more what we'd expect. From what we can tell of the written evidence, fortunately, we don't have any recordings of Old English, but from what we can tell is that all words in Old English that start with the consonants sc are pronounced sh, at least at some point in the language. And they develop from an earlier sk, which Old Norse preserves. When we see that uptake of sk in Middle English, often with a specific spelling to match to convey this in writing, this is we can fairly say this is going to be an Old Norse influence. So, like I said, skirt, shirt, skull would be another one, where I think it's still used in Scandinavian languages to this day, which skull not only then has the sound sk at the beginning of it, but also it's just not present in the Old English record, prior to the date where the Old Norse influence comes in. So yeah, words like this, very, very specific, sort of concrete phonetic features that we can hone in on and say, yeah, that's an Old Norse influence.
And of course, it's also a good reminder of why we need to look at the languages as they existed when they were interacting. People forget about this and want to draw, say, vocabulary that comes into English through Norman French from, modern day on the street Parisian French, which is not what was interacting with English 1,000 years ago.
Nope.
And the same thing with Norse, because if you don't realize that the phonology of Old Norse is quite different from, say, modern Norwegian, you're going to miss that these words spelled with SK or pronounced with SK, because actually that palatalization has now happened in, say, Norwegian and Swedish, right? So we have the English word skill from Old Norse. Well, that root in Norwegian is now shill.
Yeah.
Right. So it pays to know what's interacting with what at the right time. And that is I think actually part of that intuition that's not necessarily as immediately obvious to people, that all of the languages involved are changing over time.
Yes, absolutely. And it leads to these interesting situations which always amuse me, at least on just some sort of academic level, but where one language borrows from another language and preserves something that the borrower or the borrowee language or the giver language itself then loses. So that would be a perfect example how, yes, Old Norse has sk, English has preserved this little, this consonant cluster in places where, say, Norwegian and Icelandic have since lost it. This always amuses me that so many words that English gets from French, for example, a lot of them come from Old French, as you say. A lot of them come from specific dialects of Old French, sort of a general Northern or Central Old French. These are the two likely sources. And very often, these English preserves things that modern French itself has lost or changed. So there's lots of examples of sounds where you may have noticed, I don't know, to pick an example, English has chair, perfect example, chair, which is now become chaise, or judge, for example. Judge has that nice those two affricate sounds there. Well, it's become juge in modern French. French has changed, English has not, which I always think is interesting how bizarrely the borrowing language can be, in some regards, the more conservative of the two. It doesn't matter at the end of the day. It doesn't make French people and their language any less French, but it just amuses me, at least, to say sometimes that English can be preserving a little bit more of Old French than actual French does. So,
and I think in the case of chair, you have not just a more archaic pronunciation of the ch in French, but also I think the r is a different outcome in Norman French than the s in
sure, yeah,
Parisian French. So you have kind of two things going on. And of course, one of my favorite examples of this is Finnish, where you get these 2,000-year-old forms of Germanic words,
yeah,
like Kuningas for king,
incredible,
just frozen.
I mean, the idea that Finnish might be preserving these seriously old sounds as well. I think Finnish tends to preserve the e vowel, where it's generally changed to e in Germanic languages, but we can hypothesize that Germanic had it originally. So something like ring, which I think is still hereki in Finnish to this day, with the r beginning. It's amazing. I love examples like this.
Which word is that?
Ring. So I think ring.
Finger ring?
Yeah, finger ring.
Ring, I think is ringas. I could be wrong. But
no, well, I might be thinking the wrong one then.
But I think one of the words for sword, the one that becomes makir in Old Norse, I think is an a in Finnish.
Right.
But I'm getting out
Well,
of my
there you
depth.
go. Finnish, and why not? Just because the Germanic languages are changing doesn't mean that Finnish has to go down
Yeah.
the same trajectory. Oh, what's
Okay.
this?
Blake says it's Mieka. So I
Mieka.
think that comes from the E, which is the E1 in Germanic. Anyway, yeah,
Right.
but the point stands, the Finnish has these words have not been subjected to the same sound changes in Finnish as they have been in the languages they came from. So it's similar
Yeah,
to that share example.
that is
There was also
fantastic. Yeah,
a question here from
please.
Cameron. I'm interested in the process of borrowing Norse words into English and what exactly prompted so many basic words from Norse to be taken up. Can we safely assume a considerable degree of bilingualism and language mixing in Eastern England?
Wow. Yeah, fantastic question. I'd expect nothing less of Cameron. Uh, I think that's a great question, and yes, there are all sorts of historical implications for the intense influence of Old Norse on English. I think you have to. There's a lot that we can say of it on the basis of the word. So as Cameron correctly points out, there's a lot of very basic vocabulary that English today gets from Old Norse, far beyond the sort of the what may be the more slightly more common situation where what a language is borrowing and getting from another language is much more on a needs must level. There's some concept or there's something that does not exist in that culture, and we're going to get the word for it as well. Old Norse and Old English, it goes way beyond that. In fact, we can tell at least that this is a slow process. That may sound trivial, but it is something that diffuses through the dialects of England, Scotland, slowly, perhaps in certain geographical directions. We do, and this often goes unmentioned, we do have Old Norse borrowings in Old English, so the earliest state of English. There's about 100 of them, and they very much are, as I say, those kind of needs must types of borrowing. So they're things like law, the Old Norse word logu, which means law, or hustings, the husting, which is that kind of like those political sessions and assemblies. That makes sense that those are the words that are going to be borrowed first, because Old English writers need terms to describe these things that are happening now in England and that they will hear about happening in Scandinavia. We also need to think about the specific contexts. What are our Old English sources? Well, when these later borrowings are happening, and appearing in the record, our borrowings are primarily West Saxon. So they're in the south, particularly around the court of Alfred the Great and of Wessex. So absolutely, these ones are very much, these are people who are somewhat removed from Old Norse speakers. Old Norse speakers are the people they keep fighting against. So we don't have that kind of close interaction and cooperation in the the society of the people who are writing those Old English sources. Take things forward a bit, wind forward the clock. Middle English, much more kind of even spread across England, across the dialects of England as well. So we're no longer focused on Wessex, but we're getting stuff from the Midlands, from the north of England. And it's no wonder then poof, wow, the Old Norse influence is now exploding. I mean, it's no wonder. So partly that, yes, that is to do with chronology, but partly because we're now seeing a variety of dialects. By the time these Middle English sources are coming along, people have been in contact for a long time. So to return to answer Cameron's question, definitely there's going to be a high degree of bilingualism. Communities have been, rubbing up against each other. They've been intermingling, with some languages being more concentrated than others. So we could assume that places with good access to the sea in the west and in the east and the sort of the northwest of Great Britain, they're going to be perhaps more densely Old Norse speaking. Further inland, yeah, well, this is all fairly reasonable, where we would expect to find this language. they've been in touch for a long time now. These communities are extremely well established. There's one idea, I think, by Hope Dawson. I think it's in her PhD thesis, the idea that even some sort of Koine had emerged, a lingua franca in Northern England, which was a sort of a really good blending of the two. It's not to say that English descends from that lingua Koine, but it was probably going on in places like York, places like Leeds in Northern England. So that's fair to say. But there is an additional factor in all of this to kind of wind the clock back even further. The languages already would have been fairly mutually intelligible, comprehensible to each other. Absolutely different, but not so much as to say that this had to take a long time. I think we need to frame the influence of Old Norse on Old English, not only in the situation in which contact was happening, but in what the situation already was before the influence gets started. Yes, okay, they are very different languages, but you're an Old English speaker, you're an Old Norse speaker. A house is still a hus, a dog is still a hunt or a hundra. I is still it's itch or it's ek. They're not too different at the end of the day. So I think it's with all of that in mind, it's not too surprising. The influence kind of starts to become inevitable, really, that Old Norse would have such a legacy today.
And do you think there's any syntactic influence from Old Norse onto Old English?
Oh, you said the S word. I'm happy now. Yes. For context, I am first and foremost a syntactician, so that's definitely right up my street. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is yes, but not that much. At least not in terms of a lasting legacy, ones that has kind of continued to percolate until today. By syntactic, I'm going to include everything. So stuff like word order, morphology, the more functional stuff in a language, a kind of broader definition. With that in mind, then there are some influences of Old Norse. So there's things like the pronouns, for example. The third person plural pronoun in English, they, their, them, is most likely an Old Norse influence. I vaguely remember somebody arguing quite convincingly that it may have existed to some degree in a dialect of Old English, but I couldn't find that when I was trying to do some digging before this. I couldn't find where I'd read that. It is one of those things that even if it is present in English, wow, it takes off in Middle English. It takes off after Old Norse. So it can be ascribed to Old Norse as a consequence.
Yeah, the vowels in it make me think it has to be Old Norse because that's a long
Right.
A in the cognate in Old English.
I mean,
I have one just to throw a syntactic bone in here. I have one potential thought about a syntactic influence from Old Norse on English.
Okay, sure.
Relative clauses in Old English are typically headed by an inflected form of the so-to pronoun.
Indeed.
Whereas relative clauses in Old Norse are they may be headed by that, but the thing that makes it a relative clause in Old Norse is the particle s or er later. So it's a fairly simple uninflected relative particle, much like th or that in Middle English or that in early modern English. And in our more elaborate modern relative clauses with who or which or that, I think are actually deliberate attempts to sort of calc a more Romance language-like situation, right? And everyday spoken English, just the person that I saw sounds fine.
Yes.
So I've wondered if just the prevalence of that as a relative clause marker, not that the word itself is from Old Norse, but if the simplicity of the structure is from Old Norse.
That seems possible to me, a possible candidate across many languages, English being a good example. There is this kind of conveyor belt of, in the way that we create relative clauses over time, in the way that, a word may start being the relativizer, the thing that signals that it's a regulative clause and what or who it's about, and that in time kind of reduces and reduces and reduces and then falls off the end of the conveyor belt, and another one has to then come along.
Yeah.
In a word, this is grammaticalization, which is a super common thing. It's perfectly possible in my eyes that at some point along this journey, the Old Norse way of making these things, comes along and has an influence, particularly in this idea of a conveyor belt, where there's already some sort of impoverishment, where the native construction is, for example, I don't know, it can't bear stress, it's perhaps too short, it can't inflect fully. So that would be the example of Old English the, which is the usual relativizing thing. The doesn't change. It can't change its features. And so something that can, an alternative word, may be desirable. So it's possible. And then, as you say, then we get something that looks a bit romancy coming on with our what, where, which is in itself a pattern that has happened elsewhere in Europe. It happened in the Slavic languages, for example, where for some reason the interrogatives are coming in to sort of pick up the slack. So sure, it's possible. I need to do some digging. I have to do that.
Well, and for the record too, I think that what you mentioned with a native construction not being able to do everything that people want to do with it, it's probably behind Old Norse they're, them coming in, because the he, here, him forms in Old English are so easily confused with singular forms.
There you go. So as you say, something else comes in to pick up the slack. It does happen. If I may, it's unrelated to this, but I have just remembered something that I really love, and I can't really call this a syntactic influence because it is just one word. Maybe you know about this, but it really is just it's little lexical curiosity. The word ado, as in much ado about nothing, is potentially, I happen to think this is the most likely etymology for it, looking at the record, could be a legacy of Old Norse infinitives, where infinitives in Old Norse tend to be introduced by at. And so ado is kind of a remnant of a longer infinitive clause, if you can call it that, where rather than it being introduced by to, as in standard English, to do, it's at do, where that's the potential Old Norse influence. I love that idea, and it does seem to be borne out by what evidence we have for this strange word. So just a little nugget there of Old Norse.
I could see it, and in fact, it reminds me. Of course, it's a different construction, but of other expressions from Old Norse that are from the preposition on, right? Like akimbo, aloft. That's interesting. Huh. Much to do.
Much to do. There you go. A little bit of Old Norse hidden in Shakespeare there. And as well, perhaps a final example of this would just be not really syntactic, but at least as a sort of functional word, till and until. These are words where we have like a handful of Old English attestations. I'm really talking fragmentary. And then all of a sudden in Middle English, boom, until, till, these are very, very common prepositions or conjunctions. So yeah, it's that would be a pretty good example of how Old Norse can come in and either bring something new to the language or revitalize something. Because as I'm sure you've mentioned before or covered before, till is basically the default preposition for to in Old Norse. So something like, to, I can't think of it, to Asgard is something like till Asgards, with a nice little genitive there, which I think is very interesting. The fact that it's always the genitive. It's very unusual for a preposition of motion towards, that it should be the genitive, which hints at its origins as a noun, which I think is very cool.
Right. I was going to say, the theory is that was a noun, but
yeah.
So by the way, I don't know exactly how much time you have. We've taken about an hour of your time. So if
I'm good.
Let us know. Couple of questions I see here. Marie had asked, I'm wondering what resources or processes could help with tracking etymology of Old Norse words. Is there a good
Wow.
dictionary or database? Is there a good resource on Proto-Norse, or do we just not have enough written evidence for
Right.
that?
Great question. Yeah. I think there are parts of this that I can help to answer, and parts I think I should respectively bow out from. I think that, yeah, for resources or processes, I mean, a good place to start would be Wikipedia, for example. So I believe Wikipedia does have articles that track the specific developments of Old Norse. They may not be specifically, they may not be very immediately accessible, in that they might require some sort of linguistic literacy for terminology, jargon, IPA. But anyway, that is one place to start. Alternatively, there are some very good big bumper etymological dictionaries out there that deal with Germanic languages specifically. They are somewhat accessible. It does depend on what permissions you may have access to, but things like the Leiden dictionary of Proto-Germanic, which is something that I access very often. I think that's by Gus Gronen, I think, who wrote that
Yeah,
one. Yeah,
Kronen,
Cruz
yeah.
Gronen, beg your pardon. That's an awful Anglification there from me. And then also I think Vladimir Orel, I think, or maybe Don Ringe. But there are big etymology books out there that would absolutely include some Old Norse, and they would be, a real kind of whiz through all the connections that we can make. As for Proto-Norse, that's over to you. Yeah, not much to say about that.
There is the classic etymological dictionary of Old Norse is Jan de Vries dictionary in German, Altnordisches Etymologisches Wörterbuch. Of course, I feel like I look at this book all the time thinking, where does that word come from? And pretty much if I've wondered about it, it's a word where he's like, so,
yes,
like, well,
I know that
great.
feeling.
So we're both,
Yeah,
so pretty much at this
it
point,
happens.
if I can't figure it out, he couldn't figure it out. So.
It happens more times than I care to admit.
Yeah.
It's kind of,
yeah. Hus, I'll never forget him because 15 years ago, when we were both students at the University of Iceland one summer, we had a contest to see who could memorize more of Havamal. Interesting guy.
Where are these conversations in my life? I don't spend enough time with historical linguists, unfortunately. Sounds awesome.
By the way we ran the contest was the last day we were both there. We flipped a coin to see who would start with the odd stanzas. And so we just had to keep going and see who stopped. Right. Who couldn't do the next stanza after the other. And I can't remember how far we got, but I think we got almost all the way. Anyway.
Incredible. I love it.
He's an interesting guy. I don't remember who won.
There's a lot to remember.
But yeah. Blake asks, this is not Old Norse related, but would you be willing to give a quick explanation for how we know German haben and Latin habere are not related? Do they have any connection back in Proto-European roots? That is a good question.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a good question, and I think that implies some good background knowledge already on the part of BK Winter. Sorry, I don't know if I should say that people's names out loud, but I think that's well said. Yes, it is, and key it is to do with Proto-Indo-European roots. It's to do with the sound laws. These sound laws that we have created for ourselves. I think created may not be the right metaphor. I think philologists might prefer discovered. They do force us to accept certain counterintuitive positions, and the connection between haben and havere would be a great example. One of these is a Germanic word. One of them is a Latin word, and our beliefs and our theories about where these sounds come from don't allow us to connect up the sounds in the two languages. They don't allow us to join the dots. So, for example, a word that has h in a Germanic language tends to come from an original k sound. That's well known as that's Grimm's law. And then something that has at least an initial h, so h at the beginning of a word in Latin, tends to come from a g, a voiced, a breathy g sound. Really not a million miles away, but still unfortunately there's a leap that is too far to cross that would allow us to connect up those particular words. It's sometimes the sound laws do force us into these positions. Naturally, I think a very fair skeptical response would be to then change the sound laws. You come up with them and clearly they're not working, they're not explaining the data. But I think these exceptions are just too few. I mean, we really would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater if we were to somehow change the sound laws that we could connect up these two words. We'd lose a lot in the process. And I can also bring in, there's a little bit of semantics. The meaning of the words aren't a complete fit. It does seem that in older Latin, habere does not, its primary sense is not possession. It's more something like hold or grasp. And when you bring in that, they're kind of, you can kind of see maybe these aren't related after all. But yeah, awesome question, really awesome question.
As Thomas suggests, the Latin cognate to the Germanic hab or have word is capere. Right.
Brilliant. Yes, of course. Yes, there is, there is actually one. So again, if suddenly we alter the laws that would allow us to connect up habere, well, what do we do with capere, which again needs to, it's like to take or to seize, and we've lost it. We've lost a lot. So yeah, that's the general idea.
It seems like any two languages that are connectable will always have at least one really tempting set of false friends. Another
Absolutely.
famous one is Latin deus and Greek theos for God.
Yeah,
right?
So similar. Yeah,
it seems like that should be the same, but they're from totally different Indo-European roots.
it does.
But I think, I think
if
that's
we were to
more
connect,
interesting.
yeah, it is interesting as well. It does flesh out things, and again, that's a perfect example because if we were to kind of get rid of it, if we were to lose that the sound laws as they stand and work to connect up Deus and Theos, then we'd lose the connection between I think it's Deus and Zeus, for example. I think those two actually are cognates, the god Zeus. I think I've got that right.
Yeah,
and
then
we'd lose it.
Faunus. Right.
Yes,
Theos,
that's right. An original D. So I think if you're skeptic about some conclusions that you're seeing from at least someone who purports to be an etymologist, my kind of immediate gut reaction is at least to say, well, they've probably worked this out. There's all sorts of stuff that goes into these conclusions. I mean, just take a look at the Wikipedia page for Indo-European sound laws. I mean, it's vast. And it's a lot of work. I mean, it's been going on. I mean, the field is now 200 years old, or 250 years old perhaps, and it's been going on for a long time that we've been connecting up these sounds. So I just have a sort of, I don't call it naivety, but a sort of trusting nature that linguists of languages that I don't know have done their work, and sound laws would be a perfect example of that, of all the stuff that's going on in the back of their brains.
Yeah. Well, and then when specialists in another language family or area tell me that they have no idea, I also take them at their face value. Like, okay, well, as a complete outsider who doesn't know these languages, I'm not going to figure this out.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
So speaking of questions like that, Cameron asks if you could perhaps list a few of the most mysterious words in modern English from an etymological point of view.
Oh, wow, awesome. Yes. Like I said, we mentioned that, the experience of coming across a word that doesn't have a particular origin. And it's a feeling I've come across it often, and it's often kind of like, right, okay, well, I guess that tweet is not going to happen then. So yes, I know this feeling well. And funnily enough, it tends to be words that are somewhat homogenous in what part of language or what sort of semantic sphere they belong to. They tend to be words that look vaguely Germanic. They don't look Romance, so we can kind of discount French, Latin, those that direction, and yet they just pop up in the 17th century. They just suddenly burst onto the scene in the historical record. We've got nothing before then. So I'm thinking of, for example, dog is a very famous one. Dog, frog, pig. Bizarrely, these are all kind of key words for the basic vocabulary, the words for animals. They all end in this G, which looks like some sort of suffix, perhaps, an animalizing suffix. I don't know, but they don't come. And then dog, of course, this has this meteoric rise to prominence, completely ousting hound or hund in Old English, and now becoming the default. And it just seems to appear out of nowhere. It really is quite an unusual one. Again, other pieces of core vocabulary, bad, big as well. I mean, these are words that we might say in every sentence. So very, very strange that these short monosyllabic, vaguely Germanically looking words that are just infuriating. They really are infuriating. And I am not like a lexicographer. I've done my best to acquaint myself, and I trust that the good people of the Oxford English Dictionary who've done their research, they don't know. So I definitely don't.
Yeah, I think big is one of the most surprising ones because there's a huge, not to say big, vocabulary of words for largeness in all of the languages that English has been in contact with or related to. We have in Scandinavia, there's mikkel, there's stor. In German, there's close. And you have lots of words from Romance. And yet amid all of these words that could have had an input on English, we have a word that seems to come from nowhere.
It just comes from absolutely nowhere.
Yeah.
I very often, I think, a kind of immediate response is to then say, well, how about Celtic, right? Some of these famed Celtic influences on English still doesn't match up, still doesn't help as well. I mean, pig, we have this vague connection to the kind of the more secure family of pig words that includes Latin porcus, for example, hence where we get the word pork from. And yet it's just infuriating if that is the English, kind of the English relative of this family, that if it hasn't been borrowed and it is somehow inherited, it has none of the sounds that we would expect. We wouldn't expect it to have the P, of which there is actually a likely English candidate for, I think it's farrow, I think it's, and that is what we would expect. So, but disregarding actual, the actual English member of this family, is just infuriating how it's somewhat similar, but not similar enough. Infuriating it may be, and I certainly don't use that word lightly. I'm a pretty mellow guy, and this can be frustrating sometimes. I will admit that I think we have to take the view that we should also expect this. We are dealing with language which is impossibly messy and diverse. I think we should expect some glitches. I think it would be even more suspicious if we could explain every single word, if that makes sense. Our sources that we are working with are historical written sources. They are written by humans. They're written in particular contexts by people for particular purposes. They are not attempting to capture every word in their Middle English dialect. Of course they're not. It'd be awesome if they were, but they weren't. And I think at the end of the day, there's something oddly reassuring about the words that we can't explain. It makes a language perhaps seem more real, a bit more lived in. Sure. That's my feeling, at least.
I see what you mean. Two related questions. Yole had asked, well, could some of these words be slang that caught on? And Ben asked if perhaps they could be baby talk that caught on. Are those possibilities? And
these are great questions. Slang in particular, I mean, what do we mean by slang? We're talking about words that might be limited to a particular community, language community, and that have initially served some sort of purpose for that community, like marking identity, marking belonging, and for some reason burst their boundaries and leave that community. That's possible, and it's entirely possible that there are words that all sorts of like kind of the undercurrent of language, the words that don't make it into the written record, because the written record, well, who it's written by, it tends to be written by, well, necessarily it's written by people who are literate. That kind of narrows in on one part of society throughout the sort of Middle English and Old English period. They tend to be religious. They tend to be men. They tend to be from well-off families, so that they have enough money to enter the monastery and get the kind of job where they would be writing things down, rather than, say, the lay brothers who are out toiling the fields. So it makes sense to me that there could be all like this kind of undercurrent of real language that doesn't make it into the record. I'm not going to use the word slang in this context, but what immediately comes to mind would be something like so-called vulgar Latin, or vulgar Latin. I'm not going to speak against this term, but I do prefer substandard or sub-elite Latin, where all components of that language or those languages in the Roman Empire could be called slang. And they don't make it into the written record, which is really quite standardizing and quite conservative, what we have of written Latin from the Roman Empire. And then, of course, it does make an appearance when all the infrastructure of the empire, when everything's disintegrating, and now these words can come to fore, and we have the Romance languages, where very often, it fascinates me that sometimes, almost like diving into a pool, we have words that are present in Old Latin, in the language of, say, Plautus, which isn't quite so conservative. It's not quite so interested in a sort of written standard. Plautus wrote comedies, so it tends to be pretty authentic, sort of street speech. And then it takes a deep dive into obscurity and of kind of like the nothingness of history before re-emerging in the Romance languages. So a word, for example, like belos, which means beautiful, it gets buried by pulcher, which is the much more normal word for beautiful in classical Latin. So you could say that belos gets resigned to a particular social circumstance. I don't want to call it slang, but there are all sorts of words that could emerge from that, and we just don't see them. We only have the resources we have. So, yeah, I like that.
I think it's a great example. That in fact slang can be quite old in that way. Yeah.
Swear words in English can be so frustratingly hard to see where they come from. And they would be perhaps a pretty good example of something that's slang-like. They just don't make it into the record because people aren't writing them down, because they're swear words. It's unfortunately the good people of the past, God love them, were not thinking of future etymologists when they were writing these sources. Yeah, what can you do?
No, but how much stranger would the writings have been if they were?
True, very true.
A nice kind of toward a wrap-up question here is, how can we follow you online?
Right. Oh well, that's quite flattering. Thank you. I hope I can make good on that vote of confidence. I try to consistently post etymology stuff as well as pictures of my cat. So if you don't like cats, then probably best avoid. So I'm on Twitter. I am at DannyBate4. Not a very original name. I think I was just presumably the fourth or the fifth to join Twitter and to sign up. I imagine there is somewhere at Danny Bate who I must challenge for the title at some point, but at DannyBate4 is me. I also have my blog, where once a month at least I try to write some sort of accessible piece that kind of dives into a little bit of historical linguistic research. Last month, I wrote something introducing my jokey idea of the almost Romance family, which I had great fun writing. I think, it's probably not very self-explanatory, but it's the idea of languages that are almost Romance, but not. And then this month, I'm hoping to write something about Old Irish. I try to keep everything somewhat accessible. That's the hope, and I hope I somewhat succeed in that endeavor as well. So blog and Twitter, that's me.
Cool. You got several excited responses when you mentioned Old Irish. So you're talking
It's
to the right
worth it.
you're talking about the right
It's a
crowd.
I definitely talked to well, I should have expected this. You know, it's a wonderful audience. The Old Irish is fiendish, but definitely worth it. And I'm currently trying to put together something about how Old Irish is so great for doing kind of linguistic archaeology, where like the older stages of the language can still be seen in the language as we have it, which I think that's something I'm trying to put together.
Yeah, it is a weird, difficult
Yeah.
language.
Oh yes. Yes,
I
very
have
much so.
I have Tournes in and consulted more frequently than I think people would suspect. But oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Well,
It's
uh,
it's so interesting from a certain point of view, and people who the real experts on Old Irish, of whom I am absolutely not one, but the people who specialize it can be at great pains to show the method in the madness, and it really is there. But it is one of those languages where you do need to get into the theory and the history of it to make it make a bit more sense. It's one of those things where one of those awesome times in human language where a real handful of changes and of processes combine, and through their combination have just such a massive effect, like they disrupt everything. You know, we can basically say that perhaps three very common phonetic processes took primitive Irish, the earliest stage of the language, from having 18 sounds or 18 consonants to something like 45 in the space of, we're talking, what are we talking, primitive Irish to Old Irish, some centuries, a matter of centuries. So again, really fascinating case study, but I'm hoping to do my part to sort of unpick it and make it accessible through this blog post. So that's the plan. Now that I've said it out loud, I actually do have to write it. So that's good.
we'll hold you to that.
Thank you.
Other questions or remarks while we still have our guest here? One of you. Well, we got a lot of nice compliments for you here.
Oh, that's very kind. Oh, thank you. Thank you all.
And
very nice.
I'd like to see if we could get you back in 2023 to talk about historical syntax. Actually dig into that a little bit. Because, you know, my master's thesis was on a historical syntactic question. It's something I take an interest in, and I think gets obviously has for a long time been really neglected. But as I've been working on this new textbook for people to learn to read Old Norse, I have been trying to incorporate a lot more syntax than those books usually do.
Yeah.
And man, it's kind of tough to teach.
Yeah, no doubt. But it's so cool. It's just so cool. I love it. You know, it keeps me going. It is my reason for getting out of bed every morning. Historical syntax. As sad as it may seem, but I'm just, you know, I'm fascinated by it. And the Germanic languages have a lot to tell us about the way that syntax can work and the way the kind of trajectories that it can take. And also there is also, you know, an additional benefit to talking about it, which is that for people who are trying to learn these languages, it's very helpful. Bizarrely, something that's like very theoretical, something like the verb second rule, this fascinating phenomenon, this very Germanic thing where the verb is second. Having it explained to myself, to me at least, by my syntax lecturer at the time, made sense of all the German I tried to acquire. It was like, you know, light bulb. So I think it's I don't want to get on my soapbox too much, but I maintain that it is interesting on its own merits and also really handy for learning these languages too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we'll have you back then at some point in the new year. And for now,
Okay.
I'll wish you happy holidays over there and a happy new year. And everybody else, all the best.